And of course many Australians, innocent Australians who were beheaded in Malaya, Ambon, Rabaul and so on, maybe paid for that, although the militarists were pretty nasty people. The Japanese militarists were pretty nasty people. And it ends with Billy Hughes with his hearing aid baiting Woodrow Wilson, saying, Woodrow Wilson said, of course, and being politically incorrect. You know, Australians, if you give them a bad name, they'll be politically incorrect at the drop of a hat if they don't start breaking the windows. Woodrow Wilson piously said to him, if you are given a Class C mandate over New Guinea, you will of course let free access of missionaries into New Guinea. And Billy Hughes outrageously said, yes indeed, the natives have been hard up for a good missionary to devour during the course of the war, and will be only happy to send them as many as they need. So we end up with, of course, an Australia that's actually divided because the officer class is very worried about the Bolshevik uprising, which freed up all those German divisions for the Western Front. And who stopped the German advance, spring of 1918? 5 Australian divisions gave them their first, started the retreat. I'm not being jingoistic about that, it just happens to be the truth. Some people say the offensive had run out of steam. Many British historians say the offensive had run out of steam, but whether it had run out of steam or not, we stopped them, and it was on that basis that Hughes operated at the peace conference, but it was on that basis that Bolshevism seemed an evil, and the industrial workers of the world was setting fire to buildings in Sydney. There was great industrial unrest, and so the officer class and many others came back from the front, either very bolshy, the troop ships, a lot of the officers, despite the tradition of fraternity between officers and men, a lot of officers weren't game to go down onto the troop deck on the transports on the way back, because the war saw the Australian Army in a very rebellious condition. So we would, after 1920, and this will happen in Volume 2, begin to see the emergence of private armies, like the Old Guard, the New Guard, the Farmers' Army, and so on. Fascinating emergence, and the emergence of the Communist Party they founded in 1921. That'll be in Volume 3. No sooner founded than they split, of course, into the Sussex Street and the Liverpool Street mob. But that is what is inherent in the end of the book, anyhow. Yes, it was hard to be a stroppy Sheila then. It was much harder than it was now, and there's a lot about the part of women in Federation. The early feminists, Mary Wollstonecraft and Rosie Scott, and their part, they did a deal with the fathers of Federation that if they brought in the women's movements, including the temperance movement, to promote Federation, would the federal government give them the vote? In fact, would they put it in the Australian Constitution? And I think wisely, people like Deakin said, no, we can't put it in the Constitution because that will only give men an excuse to vote against accepting the Constitution. But I promise that it will be in the first phase of legislation, the first session of legislation in the Federal House will give the franchise to women. And so that was the deal, and Australian women got the vote as a result in 1902. and voted the way their husbands told them, I suppose. But of course, the secret ballot prevented that. You know, the woman could say, "Yes, dear, I'll vote Conservative," and then go in and vote Labour. So the women were involved in that federation movement, and then Vera Deakin was not the only woman who participated in World War I as a source of information. There was a woman called Miss Chomley from Melbourne who worked a spinster Larry, and she worked in London, and she dealt with the prisoners of war. And in our legends about World War I, the prisoners don't figure. The prisoners of the Japanese in World War II have a place in our national mythology, but the blokes captured on the Western Front don't figure. And the correspondence between Miss Chomley and the prisoners is extraordinary to read. And there's a picture in the book of an Aboriginal. You know how all culture then was obsessed with skulls. No sooner was Sydney settled than Sir Joseph Banks wanted Philip to send him a skull so he could send it on to a German scientist he knew, the scientist who invented the word Caucasian. So because there was this belief in phrenology. So an Aboriginal soldier was captured at Fromelles, at Pozières rather, and he was very popular in the camps because German scientists kept on visiting him and studying his skull, you know, for their racial theories, and they'd always bring him food. So he was the most popular bloke in this prison camp. But Miss Chomley corresponded with him too. So these women who stand up and say bugger you to the establishment naturally attract one's attention.
I have a question.
The idea, the accepted military idea, was that people in the medical corps existed to get men back to the front. Therefore, anyone who could be got back at the front, the mad, the limping, the whatever, should be sent back. The Australian Medical Corps, which was full of civilians, it had not existed except in a militia form, an informal form before the war, were very careful about not sending men back till they were ready. And so you do get a sense from the journals that the nurses in particular saw themselves as civilians, and the stretcher bearers saw themselves as civilian medical orderlies, temporarily military, and a lot of the doctors saw themselves as temporary military. So they tended to be a bit rebellious about not sending men, giving the front line the benefit of the doubt, but giving the man the benefit of the doubt. Even though by 1918, because of the defeat of the conscription referenda, we were getting short of men. And that's why the Australians were in the line pretty continuously from March till October, and that's why there was a mutiny amongst the Australians, which is also not part of the Anzac legend. But again, because I think ours was such a citizen army, the Australians never shot a man for desertion. And the Australians had the highest rate of being absent without leave of any Dominion army, to an extent that it outraged the British Provost Corps, and they wanted much severer penalties brought down. But the whole operation had that character of being civilians who were temporarily military people. So the journals of the nurses are very much the journals of civilians. And indeed, our nurses were only given rank in 1916 so that orderlies would not subject them to verbal or physical abuse. A lot of them were country girls, and a lot of them were, what did you do if you were a pastoralist or a grazier or a farmer in debt to the bank? What did you do with your daughter? You didn't want her to be stuck in the local town. You sent her to be a nurse so she'd marry a doctor.
Exactly.
And not all of them did, as we know. But yes, these a lot of the girls were from the country, and were used to being, they had this frankness and a tendency to speak up. One of them got into trouble on Lemnos for an Australian nurse was found feeding chocolate to a man who was blind, a man who'd been wounded in the head, sitting on the floor with him, feeding him bits of chocolate. For this, she was put in the mental hospital compound on Lemnos. One of the other nurses broke in to visit her, and that sort of anti-authoritarian gesture from the nurses was very common. They were not supposed to fraternize with men, and they did.
Another thing I think too.
Early in the 19th century, in the period I'm dealing with, sexually transmitted diseases were unyielding. They were hard to treat, and young Australians began to get syphilis and gonorrhea in Egypt while they were training for Gallipoli. And many of them were shipped back to Australia. Some of them were cured. Then on the Western Front, we were often in front of Amiens, the city of Amiens. So blokes went on leave and they'd visit a prostitute and say, 25 Rue Saint-Germain in Amiens, there's this great girl, you've got to go and see her next time you're on leave. And so there'd be a cumulative impact of syphilis and gonorrhea on these young men. Now, the Australian Army, you know how the Australians dealt with AIDS by, I sound as if I'm boasting about the bloody country, but we do some things very well. And one of the things we did with AIDS was to treat it as a medical problem. Whereas in other countries, there was all this denunciation from on high. It was the judgment of God against sodomites, and on the Western Front, we created blue light tents to which any soldier could go in confidence without a record being kept of his visit and be checked out for syphilis. So that's how the pervasiveness of the problem. And then post-war, how many men did not marry because they were scared of passing it on? How many families were wrecked by it? And it was the sort of thing you didn't talk about at the grocers. Mrs. McGregor didn't go in and say, how are you today, Mrs. McGregor? Oh, my husband has come back from the Western Front and given me the pox. She wouldn't tell everyone, but you wonder how many families were destroyed by it. And there are no statistics about that. There's more about shell shock, that very interesting condition. I mean, unless you suffer from it, it's very interesting.
I understood, I'm not sure, that Peak Island was a hospital that was set aside.
Yes, that's right.
With
Transmitted, yes, yeah. And some of them suicided on the troop ships coming back rather than face their families. So that's the toll of... and I mean, they could have been virgins till the one event that gave it to them. Yeah, there were a number of Aboriginals. In fact, there was an entire troop of Aboriginal light horsemen in the Middle East. Yeah. And they're interesting. There's a picture in the book not only of that Aboriginal soldier, but Chinese Australians. You know, we're supposed to be white Australia, but we had a number of Chinese soldiers. And the bloke who was the most successful sniper on Gallipoli, there's a picture of him in the book. His name is, it's a long time since I wrote the book, so you forget these things. His name's Singh. He's got the same name as a conditioner for the Manly Warringah Rugby League Club, I can tell you that. Yeah, William Singh. There he is with the light horse. He was, the Turks, he was confirmed as shooting the Turk, 150 Turks, but his death toll probably exceeded 200.
Tom, please join me in thanking Tom.
Thank you.